Hi, Larkin. Thanks for doing this.
No worries. Thanks a million for having me.
I'm going to guess I know the context in terms of what got you interested, but I'm assuming this sprung out from the last paper that you did, which was obviously related to age and human limits, specifically with respect to someone you knew well in the context of Irish rowing.
Yeah, no, definitely. That my own grandfather was Richard. Yeah, so these guys were actually friends with him, and they knew of him. They competed with him. So there's a good connection there. Also, one of the athletes, his son works with my fiance in work, and so we had a few connections there. So
Oh,
yeah,
really?
basically,
Okay.
I shared the previous study in my grandfather Richard, and they were all knew about it, were interested. Probably Paul, primarily the 72-year-old champion, was most interested, and he actually lives very near me here. So we met up and had a few coffees and sort of planned it out. So then they were talking amongst themselves. Paul was going to go to the World Championships, and he was saying to the other guys, "Oh, we should all go together, like, and see how we get on." And they were kind of texting each other saying, "Oh, it'd be funny if we all won," and then they all did win. So that kind of made it that bit more interesting.
That's fantastic. One of my takeaways is don't tangle with Irish rowers.
Yeah, I think so. There's a good click of them now. They're doing well. So
Yeah, it's so impressive.
Paul and Ken were rowing again there last week at the World Championships again, and even though they're a year or two older, they're actually still improving their times.
So let's go right into this in terms of the paper itself, and it's called "Towards the Limits." It's towards the limits of human aging physiology characteristics of the 50, 60, and 70-year plus. I guess the plus is important here. Male indoor rowing world champions, and just to be clear, and as we were talking about at the beginning, this time around, none of them are relatives, which is, I suppose, worth knowing.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So, talk to me a little bit about the protocol you set up and what your primary research question was, and then we'll get into the findings, which are just amazing, I think.
Yeah, so really the main research question is just to understand these athletes across their whole careers, how their performance changed. Obviously, we'd only get the physiological assessments now, but we can really look at their performance across the lifespan as an indirect overview of that. So really, I wanted to profile as much as I could just to gain as much understanding from them so that we looked at their diet, their training history. We looked at a load of data points. We got them in for 2 physiological testing sessions. So looking at their cardiopulmonary fitness, their power, their pulmonary function, as many factors just to paint an overall picture of, how these athletes work, what's kind of under the hood physiologically with them.
And in terms of the specific tests you were doing, why don't you walk through them? Because we're going to end up talking about things like VO2 peak and other things in a minute. So in terms of the specific metrics that you thought were most important to collect in the context of having them into the...
Yeah, so we did a fairly standard protocol, a ramp protocol, just to determine, we'll say, their ventilatory thresholds, their lactate thresholds, and then we kind of kept working them up to their VO2 peak and their max. So an all-out max test went on for about 35 minutes, 4-minute increments. So we can get a nice look then at their efficiency, their thresholds, a number of factors. So that was the first day. So once we had determined their thresholds, they come in then for another session a week or two later. And then based off that, we know, okay, this is a moderate intensity for them. So we did another moderate trial. And then from that, we can get their oxygen uptake kinetic speed, which is essentially an indirect marker of how well can their muscles take in oxygen and use it. So when you have athletes who have a faster speed for that, usually that peripheral factor is better, their muscular adaptations there. So probably they was relatively compared them to, say, a young Olympic champion. Those were very similar. So it's essentially identical for Ken, the 51-year-old, and then quite close in the value for the other two. So of course, their VO2 peak was a bit lower, lactate threshold was a bit lower, but it's nice to get an overall picture. So we kind of compared them to, we'll say, Olympic champions in their prime, how was the world champions across the lifespan, and then just, we'll say, to normal other athletes. Yeah.
So because you obviously could, this was cross-sectional, not longitudinal. It's not like you've been tracking them for decades. So was that comparing them in terms of peer groups and in terms of other Olympic athletes, was that an attempt to try and, ground it in some sense, given that you couldn't show what actually happened with respect to their markers? Is that the idea here?
Yes. So the idea, and it was a great idea from the reviewer who suggested doing that, create a sort of model like that. Now, my hunch, kind of what you're getting at even is, there are different cohorts. I mean, of course, the Olympics is a lot more competitive than the over 60s. So, but you are dead right in that, yes, if we compare them to the Olympic champion, it looks like a steeper decline. But if we look at the athlete's own performances, it's a much flatter decline, much less decline compared to their own relative peaks of their lives. So even Ken now is the 52-year-old athlete. He's just off his all-time best, and he's been rowing highly competitively since 14. So, and the other guys is again, it's a much more modest decline when you look longitudinally at their performance rather than compare them to the best of Olympic champions.
So I want to get into some of the numbers a little bit more, but two things that struck me in reading it, and you just alluded to one of them, which was really interesting to me. And this is different from your prior study. In the prior study, your grandfather, I guess it was a relatively late comer to rowing, so he wasn't a lifelong rower. What's interesting, and so I've had people make the argument to me that sometimes one of the ways that people preserve long performance is that they weren't particularly competitive when they were young, so they didn't rack up a lot of miles and wear and tear euphemistically on their bodies early, and so they were able to preserve a higher fraction of their performance for a longer time. But in this particular study, we see the exact opposite. We see, I think all three of them, if I'm right, are lifelong rowers, or at least lifelong, I should say, endurance athletes of one form or another. And you can correct me on that. And so that was one thing that struck me. So I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, definitely. Ken, as the prime example there, he's essentially non-stop training since the age of 14 and maintained a very high level, competing every year, numerous competitions. Dennis was quite similar. Maybe they'd have periods off. Definitely Dennis had a few years off. Paul, for instance, there, the 72-year-old athlete, he played basketball for a number of years.
Right.
I think he had something like a 20 to 30 year gap in the rowing. But yeah, he came back to it at 50
Yeah, he
or
came
60.
back to it. And the other one that was related, and this is something I think about a lot in particular with, I'll say, aging athletes euphemistically, is that they avoided injury. This struck me as really an important point in here, and that maybe not a confound per se, but an important distinction in terms of whether it was their training protocol, their genetics, or something else. And your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, definitely. They're very interesting points there, Paul. Even like the nature of going, you maybe even psychologically, it's hard to push yourself to your limit all your, so many decades or whatever. But I think the rowing is a brilliant model because it's a low risk of injury, even compared to a bit lower than running. There's less impacts. I mean, you can go on a indoor ergometer and, your head will always give out before you get injured or whatever. It'll be too hard. And you can see it even in terms of mileage. The rowers can cover a good amount more miles, per week and be fine. Whereas obviously there's a bit more wear and tear with the running. Now, of course, there's good adaptations you get from those impacts and everything else. But if I was to place my bets, I'd go with the rowing as just a bit less of a injury risk.
Yeah, and almost I was thinking of it, and this is one of the ways at least I think about it with my own training, as almost a dose response sense, that if the goal is to accumulate a high enough dose of, let's say, hours at intensity, however structured, pyramidal, polarized, whatever, if that's the goal, then your other goal should be to avoid any kind of injury, because that's going to upset the whole process of accumulating those hours, leaving aside the adaptations. And so your point seems to me a really important one.
Yeah, no, definitely. Even I'm thinking with my colleague Bas van Horen, he had a similar story. I know he had a marathon runner, but I believe he went many, many decades with no injuries and no problems. And even that athlete was aware of that and didn't want to push it too crazily at any particular point,
right?
Because a layoff could be problematic.
And the recovery cycle becomes even more problematic with age, and I've seen this in other data, that you get into these sinusoidal rest, recovery, return cycles, and you watch it happen over and over again, and then it becomes a somewhat of an escalator downward if you're not careful.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, I suppose that's where the previous one with my own granddad was so unique in that he just entirely sedentary, even smoked, did nothing.
Right.
Well into retirement and then started. And
it's like he'd been resting up for this or something.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
So,
So
okay, let's get into a couple of the more technical aspects that I thought were really interesting. One was this contrast between central versus peripheral decline,
yes.
which I thought was really important and in many ways overlooked in terms of how people think about this stuff. So I'll let you talk specifically to it, but the central factors like VO2 peak, for example, cardiac output, those tended to decline, I'll say faster, but even those were preserved. But let's just say faster than some of the other characteristics that had to do with peripheral decline, like you mentioned, oxygen uptake kinetics as a good example. So talk
Yes.
a little bit to that. Like that contrast to me was really striking.
Yeah, definitely. Like that was probably the key finding for me, or the most striking finding, as you said, definitely for me as well. But yeah, there's a good amount of research that seems to be the case. Like at the level of the muscle, if you took a biopsy from a really elitely trained 80-year-old versus a much younger athlete, you wouldn't hardly be able to see the difference at the level of the muscle. So the central declines that would probably more heavily impact VO2 peak. Your heart rate might drop a bit. Hemoglobin levels tend to go down a bit with age. So it may be more of a delivery problem rather than an uptake problem. So if we could get
that's
the
interesting.
oxygen around, the muscles would probably be able to take it. But we see that even at elite level, like the top young athletes, it's a delivery problem in that chain. Their lungs are nearly overbuilt. They can get in lots of oxygen. The muscles, if they could get it, could be able to use it, but it's a problem of getting it around the body. So some
And
nice
there's been some interesting studies on that. Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, there was one I was thinking about years ago that I think it was a cyclist who had a lab tested VO2 max in the low 90s. And all else equal, your expectation is that they should be able to perform really well on the bike. But it turned out there was a delivery and efficiency problem, that it didn't really turn into the kinds of cycling. I've forgotten his name, but it didn't turn into the kind of performances that people expected. And I'm thinking some of the same arguments apply here.
Yeah, like it is complicated. Even like there's so many factors at play. There's the efficiency, metabolic efficiency. Yeah. You can have a high VO2 peak, but you might be just driving it around. It mightn't be fully translating into
Right.
more watts on the erg or whatever. So it is. Yeah, there's so many factors, but that was probably the key interesting point, that maybe with exercise your muscle is highly responsive, and other systems, it doesn't all just go down at the same rate, I suppose, is a potential take home.
Right. And related to that, and this is one of the other findings that I thought was interesting, this kind of nonlinear aging trajectory, that there was I'll call it a plateau of sorts, that there's a plateau, at least in terms of the performance decline, until athletes were around 70-ish, I'll say, if I recall correctly. And then the drop, or at least the slope of the line, let's just say, the slope of the line seemed to change at that point to some degree. And that was interesting. And again, I'm curious, do you think that has to do with some of the things we're talking about with respect to central versus peripheral? Do you think that has to do with a nervousness about pushing myself to my maximum cardiovascular output, so not as much as preserved? What kinds of factors do you think are going on here?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it receives a lot of attention. Like most world records you look at, there tends to be a little bit of an accelerated slope around that 7-year-old mark. So I'm wrestling with that thought a lot, and I'm kind of weighing up, well, what could it be, and reading different things. So I suppose there's a few co-founders that might influence it. So it could indeed, be some kind of a slightly accelerated aging, but other huge factors worthy of consideration is just that the participation rates drop off. So there's just less athletes, maybe less of a high standard. It's even maybe more accelerated in female athletes, because there's just very few female athletes at the more advanced age. They probably grown up with maybe being banned from marathons, and so there is
Right.
other sociological factors that I do think we need to consider. And I suppose the best way to overcome that is just to get more lifelong data in athletes, rather than because the records, it's all different athletes jumbled together, and it's hard to be too precise without accounting for those, I would think. But at the same time, there could be some degree of a little bit accelerated aging in around that point.
I mean, I just didn't, and this is completely anecdotal empiricism, but in talking to peers who are, I'll call them masters athletes, there is this degree of two things I've seen showing up. One, it's a kind of apprehension where they actually become a little bit nervous about pushing the heart rate very hard. And the second one is there's this widespread sense that among endurance athletes, there's a higher incidence of atrial fibrillation, And so if I'm a lifelong endurance athlete, maybe not pushing as hard is protective. And I'm wondering if that plays a factor here, that it's a behavioral issue as well as a cohort and aging athlete issue.
Definitely. I haven't really considered that, but I'd say that's absolutely possibly an additional point to consider and could well be a factor as well. Even that's the psychological aspect. Definitely, I'd well believe it.
So one of the other things that I thought was really interesting in the paper was how there was more than one way to get there. The athletes had really diverse profiles in terms of how they reached that level of performance. Some had really high aerobic thresholds. I'm sure some were just, in cycling terms, we used to call them like suffer monkeys. They just could suffer like no business. And so talk a little bit about that for me, that was somewhat surprising, that the diversity of the profiles, that there was more than one path to get to this level of performance.
Definitely, that's really fascinating, and it's even great to chat to the lads explaining their programs and thoughts and different things. But yeah, there is quite a high variability. So again, it's the three athletes, and probably the biggest differences, we'll say Ken the 50 plus and Paul the 70 plus. If you look at their, we'll say, power duration curve, they have a fairly big spike at the top. So they have a good anaerobic power. They're very powerful over 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds. And then, say a round curve like that. But then with Dennis in the middle, he was, he had a massive aerobic capacity, but a much flatter profile. He just hadn't that real high peak power. And for him, he hates resistance training, does no resistance training. He does really, like, he might do sets of 2, 3, 4K. Like his program, reading it, I was like, oh my God, like it could be like 20 rounds of 1 or 2 minutes, like all really crazy aerobic stuff. And you could see that he had obviously huge critical power, huge VO2 peak. I mean, the same as Kenny, who's a decade younger and peaked there, but then just less so on the anaerobic qualities, which is very interesting.
Yeah, some of the aerobic, I think it was, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name, but the 60-year-old athlete who was VO2 peak was like 56, 54, somewhere there. That's a remarkable number.
Yeah, definitely.
Puts you out in the tail of the distribution, at least in terms of a population based, separately from what you might look like in the context of rowers.
Yeah, and I think as well, even that, I like to look at now even, VO2 peak numbers in line with, what's their 2K or what's a performance thing, just because there can be, if we had a different metabolic cart, it could be 63. If we went to another place, it could be, so the systems can be variable. I mean, my same colleague, Bas Van Hoorn, did a nice overview of loads of different CPET systems, and you could be going up or down 10%. So
oh, wow.
I suppose my learning from that is, you have all these different systems around the world. So I'd maybe slightly take that into consideration. But, your 2K time on the erg, that'll be fairly tight in terms of reliability. So. Right.
Yeah. On the training point, and this goes back to your comment just now about this scary series of intervals. What I thought, so they were mostly not, and I don't know if they thought about it in any organized way, but these were really pyramidal training plans to my way of thinking about it, meaning that like 85% was relatively low intensity. And then I think something like maybe less than that, but it's then about 30% or so. Yeah, it had to be less. So like 60% was low, 30% or something was moderate intensity. And then the balance was, the severe, we'll call it, but high intensity stuff. So this wasn't polarized. This wasn't an example of someone saying, okay, I'm going to do most of my work at low intensity and then periodically really push. This not the case.
Yeah, like it was kind of mixed in general, and they might change it slightly at some points in the year. They'd even if it ended up to be pyramidal, I think in some ways they probably intended to have, we'll say, hard days, easier, long, slow, and it just kind of panned out. But for me, the key thing with their programs is, and that was similar, is that they have this template and they have numbers that they hit along the way, so that they're shaving a second off this interval, and they're doing that, 3 months. So they know where they need to be. It's a clear, linear, nearly progression ending up with their competition. So that was another similarity. And you can probably have, variable programs, but if you keep going faster every week, you'll get there eventually, which is what they did. So,
And that's one of the
Yeah,
things I find interesting in talking to other people who are struggling a little bit outside of competition is the absence of a dependent variable. So what they had was a dependent variable. They had their own dependent variable, which was I don't know, a 2K time or something else. Granted, it's in preparation for training, but I think sometimes in terms of trying to translate some of this to normals, if you will, to people who are outside of competition, that it's really important to have some kind of objective variable, because otherwise, I won't say you're just screwing around, because you're not. Obviously, it's important to do whatever you do, but you just don't have measures of how you're doing and whether or not you're even making gains anymore or sliding backwards. You just don't know.
that's it. Yeah, like it's. I suppose the erg is brilliant. They're so reliable. Like you're of a controlled environment. You can go from 1 minute 50 per 500 to 149. It's completely precise. They know exactly
Right.
what they're doing. They'll know if they keep doing this, whatever, 2 weeks out, they'll be exactly where they need to be. And they have themselves tracked for so many years that they know this works with me and they execute that plan. But yeah, just for a general population, it would be nice, I suppose, just to have a number, because even, people are competitive. Well, they know, well, I did 5K here at such a pace. I'll, try and go a little bit quicker. But without that, some days you'd be harder or easier. You have no idea. So it is good to
No,
track.
I know.
Definitely.
It becomes a completely random event. Okay, so let's just maybe drive into some more practical things like that. So one that I thought was, in thinking about the losses in terms of the pulmonary limitations in aging athletes, I'm curious your thoughts about respiratory muscle training, other things that might play into the pulmonary limitations we saw. That if you think there's and again, not to pull you outside of your domain, but if you think there's a role for that kind of work in here in terms of as an implication of some of the things you saw.
Yeah, like it seems to be a case, maybe more so even older again athletes. It just kind of goes down. So what you're saying there, with the lung itself, begins to lose elasticity. It maybe doesn't diffuse so well. But yeah, I think you can definitely train a bit the respiratory muscles. That could be definitely a nice addition to the training. And it might even be more important the more advanced you are, particularly if you're 80, 85, that could be a good option. Yeah, so some other, I think they had probably good strength in terms of their respiratory system. We didn't get a DLCO which would measure that diffusional capacity, but that would be interesting. But it does seem to be the case, the lung might deteriorate no matter what you're doing. But you can certainly keep the respiratory muscles trained, and be that through exercise or some kind of resistive device or something.
Sure. The other one that I thought was interesting was on the nutrition front, and we didn't talk about it, but you collected nutrition data, both obviously in terms of weight, but also and this is more me reading into the study, but there was a meta sense that they were thoughtful about it, at least to a degree, in terms of, and I don't know how the weight classes work, so maybe this was all driven by weight classes in the competition. So that kind of backs out into having specific targets with respect to what I want my out of competition weight to be and what I need to eat to maintain that. So how does that work exactly, and how important do you think it was?
Yeah, so they're definitely very aware of their competitive weight. So just to be specific, it's actually slightly different. So for on-water competitions, they need to be 72.5 kilos. In the indoor competitions, it's 75. So they have a little bit more leeway, but they would all probably float around 76. And I think they kind of would just check that out, maybe more so near, a month or two before. They would be monitoring it, and they might just calibrate their own food. Really, if they're overweight, they'll taper down. So they're all year floating around that 76, 77. Now Ken, the 52-year-old, he has highly muscular frame, very lean, so he floats around maybe 78 or 9, and then he might trim down a bit. So he'd be basically exceptionally lean when he is competing. So he's maximizing the amount of mass he's getting there. But they all had a very similar approach. Again, their diet was, high protein, rich in carbohydrates, in accordance with fuel in their training, which is perfect. And they did monitor that. They weren't necessarily, monitoring their calories or whatever, but it kind of falls into place when they keep the weight in line.
Right. They were working backwards from knowing where they wanted to be in competition with respect to weight. And so where I want to be out of competition. And that just turns into my diet's okay or my diet's not okay. It's not like they were running some kind of complicated program with daily macronutrients or whatever else.
No, no. I think like naturally, I get the impression that they've no problem. Paul just said like he might, skip a few desserts the last week, and then he's there. That's kind of it. So I think they're naturally the perfect. Their weight just sits perfectly for them. So that works out.
Was it, did you have a sense if you tried to work out what their total daily energy expenditure was in terms of what kind of fueling was actually required to maintain weight? I'm just curious, were we talking about like 3,000 calories a day or 2,000 calories a day, or what in terms of total?
Yeah, I just have to. I can't think of the numbers, but in around the 3,000 for sure.
Yeah, because that's
So that,
work. That's
training
work
loads.
having
Yeah.
to, because it's easy to get there with chocolate cake, but it becomes work when you have to get there with real foods.
Yeah, like they eat, big bowls of porridge, and they'd have basically a dinner for lunch and then another dinner, so they would eat plenty, all right. And yeah, there'd be big feedings, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, carb
Yeah.
rich. And, they're obviously aware of the protein element, so they would include that as well. But yeah, a carb heavy diet, I would say, when you look at it like that. As you said,
Yeah.
3,000 is quite a lot. So,
Oh, and it's interesting to me watching, and I see this with a lot of athletes who are self-trained and focus on a competition, is as they approach it, they often just try to drop weight, but they do it in really dysfunctional ways where they end up actually slowing metabolism down and they end up losing some of the gains that they got out of performance in actually training. So there's a delicate art to this.
definitely. And I suppose that's where the resistance training is key, just to hold on to that
huge.
mass. You don't want to lose it. And it depends as well, how far are you coming down? That's going to be a big factor.
Is there anything else that you thought was really striking in terms of the changes, either the way you thought about something or suggested some areas for future research or anything like that?
Yeah, I suppose like another interesting point, even with I know we mentioned there the oxygen uptake, their efficiency was remarkably high. So for the amount of power they applied onto the erg compared to the energy they're burning, was at or above what you'd see in an Olympic champion. So highly efficient.
Right.
So maybe their peak might be going down, but their efficiency was really, really high. So that was kind of an interesting point.
Yeah, seeing that preserved was really striking because you can get away with a lot if you're preserving that efficiency. So
yeah, it is interesting. Like I suppose just all the systems changing over time potentially. But yeah, I think the future work probably goes without saying is just more longitudinal, lifelong monitoring. So I'd like to get these guys maybe back in a year or two, or even get them a 6-year follow up, or while I have access to them if they don't mind keep coming into the lab. But
so in terms of things that you think fall out of this for normals, any thoughts specifically with respect to what my takeaways were? Resistance training was super important in terms of preserving muscle mass. One was that the VO2 max decline is actually less than you might expect, and preserves far more of it than one might think. The importance of nutrition, the avoidance of injury, that for me is just such a huge one, and I think it goes overlooked too many times that it's ridiculously important to go back in the past and uninjure yourself, because if it causes huge problems later on. These are all for me really practical, and not to turn it into a practical series of recommendations, but I think there are practical things that flow out of it.
No, definitely. Yeah, like exactly what you said, the resistance training is key. The two modalities, there's so much research, like, okay, sprint or power lifters across the lifespan or just endurance. Both of them lose the things that they're not using. So like an endurance athlete, kind of, very low levels of muscle mass potentially, or the sprint athletes, they might be, world championship caliber. They might be very low level of fitness. So you do need the two things. And as you said yourself, Paul, just that you have a thing to track, that you know what you're doing, you're keeping it engaging and interesting. So like I asked the guys like what, basically motivates them. And to be honest, they just said 100% competition and the thing. They love the process. So not like all the wellness is probably just a side effect, but they enjoy the whole competition process. They know who they're up against, and they love the fun of that. That seemed to be the main thing.
And that's such a great takeaway, because having that goal, it's a goal, but having that goal then feeds back into the structure, which feeds back into keeping people doing these things that it turns out to have other benefits that they actually probably mostly don't care about is this is all about the competition, right? So.
Yeah, that's kind of it. It's funny. People looking in might think otherwise, but that's definitely the main thing.
This is terrific. I really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Perfect. Thanks a million.